Hello there and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. I'm Glenn Fay, Research Fellow here at the CIS. Improving the lives of young Australians through education has always been integral to our mission. However, all too often, the educational experience for Indigenous Australians has failed to address persistent inequities across our country. And that's despite countless initiatives, programs and spending by governments and within communities. For decades, we've committed our efforts to advance policy reform in the critical area of Indigenous educational disadvantage. Here at CIS, we've long challenged existing policy orthodoxies that have sadly done little in truly closing the gap. It's in this spirit that our discussion takes place today. Ahead, we'll be tackling how the work of educators, communities and policymakers can better confront this disadvantage. Joining me for this discussion is an incredibly impressive trio who bring with them specific perspectives and experience addressing these educational challenges. I'm joined by Lorraine Hammond, Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price. Lorraine is Associate Professor at Edith Cowan University. She leads professional learning and coaching in literacy instruction for teachers and school leaders in some of Australia's most disadvantaged Indigenous communities in the Kimberley region. Warren is Chair of the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation and formerly chaired the Australian Government's Indigenous Advisory Council. He's also the author of the recent CIS report, It's the Economy, Stupid. Economic participation is the only way to close the gap. And Jacinta is Director of the CIS Indigenous Affairs Research Program. She serves as Deputy Mayor of Alice Springs City Council and has spent decades as a cross-cultural consultant. Thanks everyone for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Now, Jacinta, I want to go to you first of all. We hear a lot about the opportunity that education has in opening doors for Australians. But what about the flip side? What is the effects of poor levels of education and how does this result in the sort of dysfunction that we're all too familiar with in majority Indigenous communities?
Well, unfortunately, it's a cycle that we see play over and over again. It's evident in all the research that exists. We know that Don Weatherburn has spoken extensively about the fact that any person who doesn't receive an adequate education is more likely to end up incarcerated, and that doesn't matter whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. But the problem is with the Indigenous community is the fact that very few Indigenous Australians are getting the sort of education that is needed to be able to lead successful lives, and of course is contributing to the high rates of incarceration, family dysfunction, of course the family violence issue. And so then their children grow up in those circumstances, and as I mentioned, the cycle continues. Now, for leaders in Indigenous communities, if they don't have an adequate education, particularly in some of the remote areas throughout Australia where English isn't a first language, then they don't have the tools to be able to survive in the wider world, to be able to then mentor and lead their own communities to better outcomes themselves. So education is vital for Indigenous Australians to move forward, and particularly those. I think the greatest gap lies between Indigenous Australians whose first language is not English and the rest of Australia, including those of Indigenous heritage, but whose first language is English. We're seeing at that side of the spectrum that there are more and more Indigenous Australians coming through university and completing an education successfully in the cities and the more built-up areas, but that it's in the more regional areas and certainly in the remote areas where the gap is the widest and education is needed incredibly in those places.
So on that, Warren, in what ways, is there a chicken and egg situation? We know education is a pathway to success, but we also need higher levels. How do we encourage higher levels of education, participation and success in the first place?
Well, you're right. Actually, you've taken the words out of my mouth. In what I was thinking, it is a chicken and egg situation. But we all know from research and historical evidence over the last few hundred years. It doesn't matter what race you are or what ethnicity or religion or whatever, even atheist or whatever. Education has always been the key. And in the 21st century, it is more than the key. It is the golden key. If we're going to make major changes for people's lives, give opportunities for kids, to build careers, and also to really empower themselves and have truly self-determination, and education is that. But the issue you have is, okay, is it a chicken and egg situation? Is that, and one of the major problems we have is that some communities out there can't see the linkage for education improving their life and improving their lifestyle and careers, because they live in communities where there are no jobs. They live in communities where they don't see those opportunities. In fact, in Dubbo, many years ago now, I remember talking to a kid, a 10-year-old kid, very smart kid, and I said, "Why aren't you at school?" And he said, "Oh, well, why should I go to school?" And then I just rolled, "Oh, you get an education, you get a career, you get jobs." And he was very smart. And Dubbo is not a small place; it's in excess of 40,000 people, and it's a major hub between Brisbane and Melbourne and Adelaide and Sydney. So it's a growing economy. In fact, it's a massively growing economy, 3%. But he's just pointed out, he said, "Where's the jobs here and for Aboriginal people?" And he was right. So we had that. So it is really about it's doing both things at once. It is actually creating those opportunities and creating those jobs and creating those businesses, which you have to have commercial profit-making businesses that do hire people. And through that process, and that's a historical fact, that through those processes, you have to have an educated, skilled workforce. And so that's where you start, that kids start seeing the logic in, we get turned up to school because we know there's a job, and we know there's that I can start a business if I study hard and I get the skill base that I need to drive forward. And these are the things that we really have to be focusing on. And we know, I know we have a lot of arguments and discussions about these things, but I don't know any community in the world that's actually got out of poverty, improved its education, improved its opportunities without having an economy, without having jobs, without having their skill-based things. But it goes a little bit further than that, and we've seen recently in regard, and Jacinta's been fighting this battle for, I was going to say decades, but you're not that old. You're still young, in regard to the crime rates and the abuse and that's what's happening in Aboriginal communities. And what I've learned over the years is there is a very strong link between that and education, and between that and getting jobs and building their communities because of those social breakdowns. And look, I'm a great fan of Don Weatherburn. He's done some amazing, incredible stuff. And he's the bloke who told me when I asked the question when I was chair of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council that I said, if I could do one thing, what would it be? And he said, you've got to stop recidivism. That's 70% of crime, and that is the reason why you're having problems of getting kids to school in certain areas.
Let's start to unpack a little bit about what this means for the school system. Lorraine, you've worked in contexts all over the country, but you also visit remote majority-indigenous schools too. What is it that you notice that's different in these schools compared to those other schools out there?
So in some respects, these schools are exactly the same as any other schools I visit, but like no other schools that I visit in metropolitan and regional areas. Geographically, they're a long way from everywhere else, in the sense that they're often 1.5 to 2 hours away from what we consider a major centre in the Kimberley, but most people would consider a very small country town. That means it's often hard to attract teachers, so you get a churn of staff, which has a really negative impact on trying to implement school improvement. These schools are often really isolated because of the weather, so you can be locked out for an entire term, which in terms of my remit, which is trying to get kids reading, It means that young children who perhaps have hearing issues don't get the access to the services they need. They don't get access to a speech pathologist. They may very well wind up behind their peers before they go to school simply because they haven't had access to services. In terms of what happens in schools, if you're a teacher, you will be running a breakfast program. And of course, that will happen in most schools that are socially disadvantaged these days. But in a remote school, you'll also be running a hot lunch program. You might be washing uniforms, putting kids into uniforms. You'll be supervising kids, brushing their teeth, blowing their nose, which is different to perhaps what you'd be doing within a metro school. You'll find you've got a small class size, but within that, you might very well have 3 year levels in one class. And you might have some issues around attendance. So attendance can range from 40% during the height of COVID to 80%, which is good, relatively speaking, either of which equates to up to 3 years missing of primary school if you continuously, attend for that number of days a week. There can also be some issues around managing behaviour because many children come to school with a background of trauma, and that's very difficult for teachers to manage. When you also think about the teaching population, you've got often beginning teachers going out into remote community schools who are just trying to be beginning teachers, let alone also coping with the fact that they may have second language learners in their room. They might be dealing with behaviour. They might be dealing with a culture that they don't really understand. And that all makes it, I think, quite challenging going into a remote school, for some teachers.
What do we do about that? How do we better prepare teachers for that kind of work?
Well, the work that I do at university is trying really hard to do that. I run units that don't specifically address Aboriginal education, but I show an awful lot of really successful young Aboriginal children that I work with in the Kimberley, and that's really inspiring for my students to see. And I think that's where we need a much stronger emphasis. I know that many of the undergraduate programs all have an obligatory unit in teaching Indigenous students, and a lot of it's about culture and history, which is very important. But I don't know that there's a strong emphasis on high expectations around education. And certainly, when I show videos of children in remote community schools to my teachers, the first thing that they notice is that the children don't often wear shoes. But, the classroom looks exactly the same as any that they've ever been in before, and the schools look the same. And that's a sense of familiarity which teachers need to feel, because before I went to the Kimberley, I predicted what a remote school would look like. But now it feels very commonplace for me to go to a remote school. So I think that, that's one way that we can support teachers in terms of a career in the Kimberley. Or in any remote community, some of my teachers will go and feel at home from the very beginning, some won't. But certainly making sure that they're equipped with the pedagogical skills to teach well makes the most difference and gives them, I think, the most confidence in what they do.
I'd like to talk a little bit here about the role of policymakers. So, Warren, we've had closing the gap targets for many years now, and notionally that was meant to help address persistent disadvantaged areas, and particularly education has always been a priority area in the closing the gap. Why do you think we've not noticed or we've not observed significant and meaningful improvements, and are we measuring the right things there?
Well, that's a very good question. There have been some huge successes, in regard to getting kids through to year 12 and into university or trades. Now, the issue has been for a long time is about, okay, how do we make that across the country? Until we start approaching things from a regional base, so Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Canberra, Dubbo, Alice Springs, Yuendamu, and other places, Karratha and so on, and Cape York, they have different issues and different problems to deal with, and the remoteness of those communities, as well as some of these regional communities which are struggling as well, attracting the type of teachers and the type of people we need. But to me, we've got to just face the reality of what's there and say, okay, this is the reality. So how do we ensure that we support the teachers. We even if they, like for instance, I've picked mathematics. Even if they're not mathematics teachers, how do we work with those teachers to work to educate people in mathematics and dealing with those issues in there? And that's what we've got to really start focusing on. In the Closing the Gap, one of the biggest majors, the previous Closing the Gap I'm talking about, was where's the economy? You can't have good health without jobs. It's not rocket science to work that out. You can't have low crime rates unless you've got people engaged in those communities and working as a whole for the prosperity of that community for a number of issues. You can't have kids going to school unless they see the logic between the reasons why they've got to go to school and where they end up at the end of the day when they graduate from that school system and they move into jobs, into businesses and other areas. Now, so we've got to deal with generational dysfunction in some of these communities. I'm not saying all of them, but some of them. So about how do we get the family as a whole to work together with these with educators and the kids to get the results we need. Now, these studies have been done, and the professor could have better answers than me. These studies go back quite a long way in regard to, okay, why does a kid succeed at school, even at a bad school, and other kids don't succeed? And it really gets down to that parental family support. Now, it doesn't matter what the education standard of the parent is. It is that they are able to infuse into the kids the importance of education, the importance of getting to school, and work with their kids to get to school, and then work with the teachers and that about getting their kids educated and getting a good education. Now, there are some successful programs going around the country, but they're only small programs. And even with the AIF, which I'm the chair of, and I'm a great supporter of what we do, we're only allowed to have 500 kids at a time. And we have a really good success rate, over 90% success rate in kids completing school, attending and completing school, and then going on to university or trades, and then going on to postgraduate studies. But that's only a tiny minority of what we've got out there and what we've got out in communities. So it's about how can we come together, working and supporting the teachers, and working with the parents and the community together, and which then can work with the kids as a team to get things to come out. Now, the success rates in any area, you will see certain things that makes it successful. Parental support for schools, parental support for the teachers, and installing that in the kids. The teachers being part of the community and working with the community and understanding the community they're working with, and being a good model and role model and for the kids. They don't have to know all the subject areas. They might know about maths very well. They might be good at English, or they might know about language stuff and that. But we can build in mechanisms to support that. And to me, and looking at those figures, it doesn't cost us very much to do that. It's just having the right focus in the right areas and pushing the right buttons for this to happen.
Thanks, Warren. You mentioned points about the engagement of parents at home. Jacinta, I want to ask you, why is it that Indigenous students in many communities simply don't have the same support for learning at home than their non-Indigenous peers?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. Education doesn't seem to be prioritised by family members the same way other issues are prioritised, and that needs to change. Communities need to change. The leadership, the family members need to prioritise education for children. And I think a lot of the politics of the South influences particularly remote communities, is influencing remote communities, and ideology is also influencing these communities, whereas it should be more common sense driven. And certainly there needs to be a lot more emphasis placed on, as Warren said, the relationship between families, communities, and the schools and the teachers. Obviously, if a child has support at home in terms of their education, then that is going to be absolutely beneficial to their educational development. Another issue is the fact that English needs to be taught properly. It needs to be prioritised. You know, the UN, of course, has stated that it is a fundamental human right to be taught the language of the nation that you live in. And I think that Lorraine had mentioned that a lot of teachers come into remote communities and they don't necessarily have the skills to deal with English as a second language. And I feel like this needs to be certainly prioritised when it comes to people in remote communities, is that English is a second language, just like our migrants are treated in the same way and are taught English. The same principles need to apply when it comes to Indigenous kids, because we're seeing that children in remote communities are getting to high school age, but are still only having the same same skill level as children in year 1 or year 2. So it is fundamental that English is taught correctly, and we can't begin to see education change for Indigenous kids out in remote communities until that happens. But again, we need to be honest about the situation that's going on in remote communities too. So if the dysfunction in families is going on, that needs to be highlighted, that needs to be addressed. Safety in communities is a huge factor, which extends to policing and all those sorts of matters. If a child's home is unsafe for them, or if there's family violence occurring in that home, then they are not going to go to school and get an education because of the trauma that they're dealing with at home. And we need to be far more honest about those situations and dealing with the family violence crisis that's playing out in a lot of these remote communities. So you can't get anywhere until we start there. And of course, health is a huge issue. There are a lot of children dealing with otitis media, and if your hearing is affected, you can't learn. So there's a number of factors going on that need to be dealt with all at once. It's very complex, but I believe doable at the same time. Yeah.
Well, look, I'm gonna use those words back at you, Jacinta. So you've said that you've made the point that the issues are complex and defy easy solutions. But at the end of the day, where do we start then? Where's the logical starting point for policymakers and communities?
Well, I think the idea of bilingual education. I think it has been romanticised to a degree. And while I'm a supporter of bilingual education, I actually don't believe that it has been effectively applied in. I haven't seen an example where it's been effectively applied. So therefore, like my mother didn't receive a bilingual education. She learnt Warlpiri at home, but the focus for her, and she was brought up in the days of the missionaries, was to understand English. And it's her generation who are far better educated than the generations that have followed. So it is about getting back to the fundamentals and, not romanticising the idea of bilingual education. If it's not working, or if it's not being applied effectively, then the priority should be to learn English. I mean, there've been senior teachers within my own family who are in those positions, but however, don't use standard English themselves, aren't completely literate, and when it comes to reading and writing English. And if they are the senior teachers in those communities, well then, the kids are going to be behind the 8 ball, and we need to be realistic about that and not romanticize, these issues and these circumstances. And certainly, I don't believe personally that it should be about teaching culture at schools. I mean, we don't teach, when it comes to migrant communities and families, we don't teach their cultures to them at school. This is learnt at home through families. And it's just about bringing it back to basics, the fundamentals. And these tools are what are needed. And, these kids need to be taught about the outside world too. They need to be brought into, understand that they are part of this greater outside world, that they are not limited to simply their communities. Education is about freedom and is about choice. And if these kids understand that they have freedom and choice, they can go beyond their communities. They shouldn't have to be trapped by their communities. And if they understand they've got freedom, you'll find that many will, if they can get an education in their later years outside of their community, they will bring that back to their communities. But if they're being caught up in dysfunction, that's certainly not going to be beneficial to them or the future of their communities if they are the community leaders.
Lorraine, I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that have come up there. So one point that Warren made was that there's a sense that you need to potentially sacrifice specialisation of subject areas of teachers in exchange for suitability of the communities in which they're serving. And so I'd like you to respond to that, but also if I can ask you to respond to Jacinta's point as well about the appropriate place for getting culture and language right in schools. And I guess that cringing phrase that we're used to in education when we hear about back to basics, and sometimes that creates a shudder down the spine of educators. But how do we address some of those concerns?
Well, I mean, I work in a project, it's called the Kimberley Schools Project. I have 23 schools, and we have worked directly with the community, and the great majority want us to teach in Australian Standard English. So that immediately means that what we're doing is going into schools and we're teaching reading according to what you might consider the basics. And I would say, picking up on your point, Jacinta, that many of the great-grandparents that I work with in community come and watch me teach. I get to teach directly children that I've never met before. The only thing going for me is my capacity to teach. I have no relationships with these children. But many Aboriginal elders will come in and watch, and they will say, that's proper teaching. That's how we were taught. And so they're very comfortable with that. So in terms of bringing, teachers in, I believe certainly into the primary school context that I work, I just need the best teachers I can find. I need them to be able to teach literacy well. Unfortunately, I can't necessarily rely on their university training to do that. I've spent quite some time this year working with the Federal Minister of Education and AITSL to ensure that universities teach reading well. Certainly any of my students going straight into the Kimberley Schools Project are very well supported. This is a very big project in the sense that they receive 4 days of professional learning. They provided with regular coaching, materials. We do run high impact instruction that's very engaging for students. So we need them to be very busy and very engaged and having a good time at school. Otherwise, they won't come back. And I'll pick up on one of the earlier points and say that the one thing that I've learned about working with Indigenous kids is they are highly autonomous, very independent, and they largely decide whether they come to school in remote communities, and many of them do. In spite of, a very difficult home environment, they get themselves to school. So I have a lot of confidence in the teachers that I work with. I would rather take a great teacher who doesn't necessarily know too much about what they're doing over a teacher who doesn't really want to be there. And we have a problem with eco-voluntary tourism in the Kimberley. We have lots of people who are going because of the boating and the camping and the fishing, and while it might be fabulous, that's not the main reason to be going. So we have a very strong push on pedagogy, and for me that's ultimately what I can do. I am merely an educator. There's a lot that I can't fix, but I can certainly do a good job with pedagogy, and when we get that right, and then we get successful students.
So you've mentioned the kind of teacher that I suppose is unwelcome or is not the kind of teacher that's likely to have success in an area like the Kimberley. What's the profile of a successful teacher? What do you What do you recognise as the sort of traits that are important to be successful in a community like that?
Well, I think if you're going to go into any community really to teach, you're going to step into a different culture. And so you need to understand that you're going into potentially a different culture. You have to be open to what it will teach you. I have learned far more from any of the communities that I've gone into than I think I've ever taught myself. So you go in with that mindset. You also go into that community being willing to share yourself, be part of that community. As you've all said, it's all about relationships in an Aboriginal community. That community wants to see what else you can do. Whether you're playing sport, whether you've got some musical talent, whatever it is, they want to know what it is. Ultimately, I think for any parent to send their child to school, they have to trust the teachers. And that's born out of, knowing who those individuals are. Teaching ultimately is an altruistic business. So I have teachers wanting to go to remote communities because they want to make a difference. Ultimately, they need to be good teachers as well. The impact of a very bad teacher on a community will mean that children will only learn half a year's worth of schooling in 1 year, but a very good teacher will enable a child to learn 1.5 years of schooling in 1 year. And because of attendance and other factors and transience and issues around schooling, we can't afford to put anyone other than an exemplary teacher in front of those children.
Jacinta, I want to touch on something else, I suppose a unique challenge potentially that affects Indigenous students more than their peers. And that's the statement that we often hear about the challenge of trying to walk in both worlds. How do we reconcile in an effective way being able to preserve and celebrate traditions and culture, but still to enjoy success in a more conventional education system?
Well, I think, children aren't going to have the opportunity to really celebrate traditions and culture and that sort of thing unless they themselves are living a successful life. And that begins with having a good education. So the emphasis, again, needs to be placed, I believe, on education. And I think part of the conversation is also about suggesting, for a lot of Indigenous Australians, they need to also understand how those, in the Western world have been successful throughout their lives. And that needs, for them to progress forward, to take advantage of the tools that the Western world has to offer, they have to understand how to do that. So it's not just about entirely expecting Indigenous Australians, to know exactly how to move forward. This is about sharing with one another what is enriching and what will work successfully on both sides when it comes to Indigenous Australia and non-Indigenous Australia. And it's looking for those similarities in working together to move forward as well. And I think there's this far too much emphasis on the romanticism of Indigenous culture without, and we give ourselves a hard time in Western society as well. But we have, it is a privilege to be able to use constructive criticism when it comes to elements of our society, elements of Western culture that don't work for us. We have to apply those same principles when it comes to Indigenous society and Indigenous culture. And as Lorraine's mentioned, the grandparents, the great-grandparents that are there in those classrooms, they are appreciating what it looks like to deliver a real education because, one, they've probably very likely gone through it themselves. And why should their grandkids miss out on that? And they too are Australian citizens. So why shouldn't they be treated as such? Why should they be treated differently because they are Indigenous Australians? We've got to get away from that notion that somehow, Indigenous Australians are totally different beings that need to be handled very gently. No, we're humans as well. And in many ways, many Australians in some ways have to straddle both worlds. It's not unique to Indigenous Australians. It's unique to, I keep bringing it up, to our migrant community as well. They have to do that. But it's not encouraged enough, I believe, when it comes to Indigenous Australia. We're told, no, you must remain as you always have been for 60,000 years. No. Let's all move forward together. That's what we have to promote if we want to see our kids succeed as well. But, what we find is that those who romanticize the culture, who like to make out as though the word assimilation is a bad word, are those who have taken complete advantage of what the modern world has to offer, of what education has had to offer. And it's hypocritical to listen to individuals like this, to those who are pushing a particular agenda, while the most marginalised, whose first language is not English, continue to suffer. It can be done. It has been done already, and we need to look at those successful examples and not continually look at where everything seems to not be working in an ideological fashion. We need to look at the practical examples that have been successful and follow those examples.
Lorraine, I'd like to go back to you again. Jacinta's talked about that grandparents in particular can identify what a real education looks like. Do you think that there are students today that are receiving an education that doesn't look like that? Is teaching different for many Indigenous students today?
No, I think there's a veritable graveyard of ineffective practices that have been allowed to basically come about because I hear that, Aboriginal children learn via storytelling and they learn by being outside. And, I was horrified when I first went to the Kimberley to meet a teacher who told me that the children would never learn how to read, so she was going to teach them permaculture because that was the background she had. And I said, no, this project will teach you how to teach children how to read because that is a fundamental human right. So unfortunately, I think that, many marginalised, societies have had all sorts of terrible things happen to them, particularly around education. There is no reason why, a child in the Kimberley can't learn to read as easily as a child anywhere else in any other part of Australia. I think that the intensity of the instruction needs to be stronger simply because children may come to school without the same pre-literacy experiences as some of their peers, and they may also have oral language issues and they may have some hearing issues. But certainly my experience working, say, for example, in Halls Creek, I have 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds being taught by beginning teachers who are delivering stunning instruction. And the data that we gather on twice a term, we measure the kids to see how they're going. They are improving, and they will continue to do so as long as we can, keep continuing to provide instruction. Unfortunately, the kind of instruction that I provide isn't necessarily considered palatable to other people. So people don't necessarily like teacher-led instruction. What we need to understand is that any human brain has the capacity to learn how to read. The problem is learning to read is something that we're not born with. It's something we learn. It's something very heavily based on oral language. And so if the left hemisphere of my brain isn't quite got its head around speaking, then learning to read on top of that is going to be hard. So it means that we have to teach kids and teach them well. And so when we systematically teach the precursors to literacy, and we do it well, we are successful. This is what the Australian government wants universities to prepare teachers to do, and we're probably the only jurisdiction in Australia that has 23 schools that are following what the science of reading actually says you should do in classrooms. So we're being very successful. At the same time, there are methodologies that are completely ineffective that are being used with arguably some of the most vulnerable children. And, they will not learn how to read. And unfortunately, when those methodologies are used to try and fix up kids who don't learn how to read, I have never found any of them to be successful. So how we begin teaching from the very beginning with the children that we work with is critical. And we need to be using evidence-based practice to do that.
Warren, I'd like to go to you next. So we've heard a lot of common sense and evidence-based suggestions put forward here. You've sat in rooms and meetings with the most senior decision makers in the country. Do they understand the nature of these problems and that there are solutions available? Or is there a breakdown somewhere in this, and how do we get past that?
Well, before we get into that, I want to go back to a previous comment that was made that I was wrongly putting forward the thing that we we need to forget about certain things and to get moving forward. When I was talking about mathematics, what I was talking about is the reality of the situation, and is that when you go to any teaching college in Australia where teachers have been taught, mathematics is not the number one subject they have. And so you're going to have, not only in Sydney and Melbourne, in the bush, you're going to have a lot of teachers who are trained in mathematics. So what I was suggesting is that we actually live with that reality. We say this is the reality. So how do we improve upon that? And that is about how do we support the teachers in these areas who aren't good at mathematics to get them to be able to be good teachers in mathematics. So that was my suggestion. That was in regard to languages, it was in regard to English, it was in regard to a wide range of subject matter. So you've got to deal with the reality of what it is, and then you can move forward. I think, going back to the professor's comment and also Jacinta's, that a lot of people get caught up in these sort of, this is the fashionable thing of today. We and forget that over several thousand years of education, I'm talking about the Western education system coming out of Greece and Rome and other places like that, is that people did get taught outside classrooms. They got taught inside classrooms. They got taught without paper. They got taught writing on chalk, and they got taught they were able to adapt to the situations that they were in and able then to move forward, coming up with ways and means of people being able to read, to write, to do mathematics, to do the education things that they needed to do. And that's how we've created these incredible educated people over time. And we've gone into many other areas like science and medicine, health and other areas. So my thing was about, okay, how we deal with the reality of what it is, but how do we then support the teachers, support the parents, support the communities to get to a better place? Because and we can do it within 5 or 7 years. That's my belief and what I've seen. And what I've seen sitting around the table with all these decision makers is that you can do these things. But people get caught up in these side issues, which sort of bends them away from things, like the argument about should we be teaching kids in English or teaching in their language. But my thing is, yes, of course you're going to have to teach kids in English because that is the language of the society we live in. And it's also, it's important, if we the kids can learn and speak in their own languages. And we've seen that done with migrants in Australia. They have Greek language schools and Croatian language schools and so on. I went to school in Auburn, which is very multicultural. We had Turkish and Lebanese and Greeks and Italians and everyone in those communities there. And we were able to still get an education standard for those kids that was very successful. Those kids, the children of those migrants went on to become the doctors and lawyers and other people and engineers and so on, and their children are going on and becoming business owners and stuff like that. My issue is that we do get caught up with the fashion of the day, and we don't actually get back to the science and actually how do we, the science of teaching and the science of educating kids. Rather than looking at the fact that, this is the fad that's going on. Now, this gets caught up with policymakers, and I'll be quite frank about this. I've worked with policymakers over 30 years, and I'm amazed at these highly intelligent people who you sit down in a room do get it. They do understand the issues, they do understand the problems. But from that corridor of walking out the door and going down the hall, to fund and support some of these educational programs, they seem to I don't know, go off in another space, and they get caught up in all these in all these things. And they've got to stop listening to the Twitter spheres and self-interest groups and actually look at about what we know over several thousand years of history of how you can educate kids. Now, and I said you can be a kid in a bad school or a good school, but you still need to turn up to school. And so, because even if it's a bad school, at least it's better than no schooling. And so we need to get kids to school. And how do you do that? Is how do you work with the family and those communities for the valuation of that? Now, as the professor said in regard to the generations, look, I look at my parents, my grandparents and so on, they had very limited education. My parents only went to 4th class, which is year 4. That was their educational standard. But I tell you what, their grasp of English and their handwriting and the form was 10 times better than what I did. And I went through high school because it was about the discipline of the class, the discipline of the teaching, and that was able to do that. Now, I look at kids today and I see very much a deterioration again. But we've had several generations now of really not school attendance issues. Like one of the arguments we had, and this is what is missing from the new Closing the Gap target, was about we need to monitor school attendance. We had this blowback from the state governments because, as people know, and COVID's really brought this out, is under our constitution, the states and territories actually run education. And not the federal government at all. The federal government has no power in a legislative sense in regard to education. They do have some power in regard to funding. They can manipulate that funding process to get things done, but it's still a very limited power. Like we said to the schools, could we get data on kids? Because if you've got a community of 100 kids and 500 turn up on Monday and 500 turn up on Tuesday, are they the same kids? So that's just basic information that you do need. And they were refusing to give it to us because of privacy issues. And we said, well, that's fine. You can have your privacy issues. Why don't we call them student X and student Y and student K42 or something like that? And then you can build this monitoring process so that you know that kids, because a kid has to spend more than 80% of the time, 80% upwards, at a school. Otherwise, their education, it's just almost a waste of time. And then we can put in place processes for that to happen. But this is the problem with the policymakers, is this insanity, as I call it, that what we said in the privacy of office and then what we said in the policy area, in the general public, in the legislative process, was totally different to what they said in the room. And this is the problem we have, that we've got to, the politicians and the communities out there have got to have courage to stand up and do what needs to be done, because the world is rapidly changing. Look, I work in the private sector, I work in cybersecurity and IT, and I work in a number of trades and engineering processes. And the world is just rapidly changing in this technology, in this space. And it's that we do. If you miss out on even a year's schooling, you're going to be finding it very hard to catch up, almost near impossible to catch up. So we've got to really start focusing on these areas and getting politicians and the decision makers within the bureaucracy, because in actual fact the bureaucracies have more power than the politicians, really, is about how do we get them to have the courage to do these things. And it's not difficult. As I said, you live with the reality that you've got a teacher who's gone into a remote community and their speciality is English, but their speciality is in mathematics. So how do we support them in the mathematics area? How do we support them also in the English area and help them dealing with a community that has English as a second or third language? How do we support that teacher and work with them to be able to educate those kids in reading and writing and that, having to deal with the reality of second, third, and fourth, and even fifth in some communities as English as a second language. Now, these things are not rocket science. It's very simple process. Look, everyone says it's complex, and yes, it is complex. But what I've learned in life is that if you keep on saying that, then it stops you from doing the policy direction and the energy that we need to put in this area for things to happen, because you just sit back and go, well, it's all too hard. Yeah. What we've got to do is break it down very simplistically and say, okay, we've got an English teacher sitting in this community. They're not very good at maths. How do we support them with their maths stuff? And how do we support them with the English stuff, dealing with a community that has English as their third or fourth language? And that's what we need to be focusing on. And that will be different to communities within each community within the Kimberleys. It'll be different to what communities in the Cape York. It'll be different to Aboriginal communities in Sydney and Melbourne. And it's about how we are agile and flexible to attack those processes in different ways. And this is what the challenge is for the decision makers, about this agility, about this, okay, people in Yuendamu, these are the issues there. This is how we've got to confront that. Oh, and in Karratha, it's different. There are some basic things, but it's a different challenge. And so how do you be flexible about meeting that stuff? And technology is our friend in this regard. How can we really do some incredible stuff? And look, I look at some of these kids who come in from these communities, and I say, the problem isn't the education system. The problem is the courage of decision makers and the flexibility of the system to actually deal with different situations for different communities.
Okay, so we've been very good here at identifying where the deficiencies are and in where things could be better. But there's also, surely it's not just a matter of failures out there. There are obviously stories of success. Lorraine, can you tell me about some of the success you're seeing on the ground in the Kimberley?
Okay, well, Warren, it's interesting because the Kimberley Schools project came about because of a politician who happened to sit on a school board that I've been involved with for a number of years in a really disadvantaged part of Perth. And she saw what happened when we put in teaching methodologies that were based on, the reading science, and we got kids reading. And so then when she came back into government and had the capacity to do something about it, so I'm talking about the Honourable Alana McTiernan here, in conjunction with Sue Ellery, who's the Education Minister in WA, through Royalties for Regions, they were able to put together a really good project. And I was fortuitous to be asked to put together the professional learning and then sort of lead the coaching in schools. So what's most important is that we have something that's system-wide in the Kimberley. So when kids move from school to school, they're not moving from one thing to another. They're moving from a fairly consistent approach, and we're able to monitor how students are going. Through the professional learning, I can be sure that teachers are doing the absolute best that they can be. It's the kind of project where we just don't ask teachers to do any more than 10% on top of what they're already doing, or they won't be successful. It'll be too hard. We have a servant leadership model, so we'll give them whatever they need. And I go in and teach regularly. So all I can say is that the pedagogy works because I can go in and do it. And as I've said before, I don't have a relationship with the children. Where I guess 2 full years into the project, it's going well. When we have teachers go into the Kimberley schools, I can guarantee them a job back in Perth in an equally high-performing school because they are highly sought after. And that's really important too, because a lot of teachers won't go to a remote school because they don't feel that they're going to be valued in the education system if they come out of it. But indeed, these teachers are, because they've had a lot of rigorous coaching, they've had a lot of support. So I would say that when the support is there, which it hasn't been in the past, I think that a lot of the communities that I go into in the past wouldn't have had good professional learning. They were kind of forgotten because they were so far away. They come together now regularly for great professional learning, and there's a great sense of, I guess when the teachers all get together, there's a great sense of collective efficacy where they feel like they can be successful. They're all pulling together, and invariably they have been really successful within that project. So it's about teacher knowledge, which needs to be a lot higher. It's also about the level of support we give to administrators, who unfortunately we lose quite regularly as well. But having good administrators in community who have worked with that community before I go into the community, so everyone's very aware of what's going on and why we're doing what we're doing. And also a spirit of openness as well. I'm very happy, and I run a lot of sessions with community members who want to come in and have a look and see what it's all about. And as you say, you know, the great frustration for me is when children don't come to school, because I will never have this opportunity again. And if children don't get a good shove from parents to come to school, then I'm sure that whatever I'm doing in the Kimberley will be judged as a failure, when in fact we are providing gold standard instruction. As I said, we're the only system across Australia to be doing it consistently, and we do get good results when the kids come to school.
And Warren, you lead the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, and there's recently that we've seen the celebration of success of those students on national television. Can you tell me more about the lessons that you've drawn from the success of the program?
Well, the success of the program is really about opportunities. So it's about creating the environment which is normal. So it's normal to go to school. It's normal to read and write. It's normal to study. It's normal to be in an environment where people want to learn more and study more. And so it's about how you create those environments and opportunities for people to do that. Now, it's quite interesting because because we talked about the fact in the beginning, and we still do. But the issue is about how we learn lessons along the way. So, for instance, one of the lessons we learned in the beginning was when the kids come in and then they went back to their communities, they didn't come back. Some kids didn't come back again. We said, well, why is that? Because they were listening to their peers. And so, okay, well, how do we, and kids, no matter who they are, kids will, you could be a nuclear scientist and your kids will always listen to their 15-year-old mates more before they listen to you. So so where if someone was spending $1, we'd spend $1.50 for argument's sake. So we'd bring peers with them. So we made sure the peers were involved in the school programs and education programs. And through that process, all of a sudden their peers said, oh, we want to be part of this process as well. We want to be part of this education system. And so for every place that we fill, we probably got about 95 or 96 other kids wanting to fill those places because of that stuff. This is where I agree 100% with you, Lorraine, in that is that kids are normally, hungry for things, hungry for ideas, hungry for learning. That's how the baby gets to stand up and fall over and then stands up and moves. And so they are. And what we do for processes and that within the education system over a period of time is we actually kill some of that enthusiasm, kill some of that. And one of the important things I think Lorraine said was we've got to make it so people want to come to school. And you don't want to come to school if it's just boring. And you've got a teacher there who wished that they were in 5,000 miles away rather than sitting in their classroom, because kids aren't stupid. Kids are the most smartest people I've ever met. They'll pick up very quickly on that. And they'll say, well, why am I sitting here if this teacher doesn't want us here? And so it's about, and there are, I'm not trying to say all teachers like that, because I've to many communities over the years, and I've met some wonderful, dedicated people who really wanted to do things and make a difference for their kids. But the way it's structured, the way it's happening, was the killer in this whole process. And so look, I saw some great programs here. I saw a program only last week in Sydney, but they actually worked. And this was the deal with abuse, kids who were abused and neglected, and that. They didn't just work on the kids, they worked on the families. And how you bring the families together, and so that you can get these this environment where they want their kids to go to school, the environment about changing their abusive behaviours and building a loving relationship and stuff. I thought it was a brilliant scheme. With the AIF, we look at those things about how do we bring families and bring everyone to be involved in that whole process. Because if you don't have that, that hunger for the education system and that's where it falls down. And this is and of course there are a number of reasons why kids don't attend school. One of them is that's a major reason, but also, as you said, and I know and other people know that when you've got an abusive community in that, then you're going to be struggling very hard to get any kids to school. And we need to be able to confront all those issues in a sensible, mature, positive and open discussion rather than from rocks and beating each other up and just sitting there and saying, okay, here's Mary and Johnny, and how do we work with them in these situations to get them to school, to get them a good education, good opportunities, and because we know that kids are hungry for learning and hungry for knowledge. Because even the kids that skip school, what are they doing? Some of them are out hunting and learning how to hunt and learning how to fish and doing all those type of things. We need to be able to do that within the classroom.
Jacinta, let me come to you as well. So you talk a lot about the importance of changing the narrative across all areas of Indigenous affairs. To what extent is that about celebrating more success stories within communities, including in education?
The success stories are absolutely so important when it comes to all aspects for Indigenous Australians, because without those success stories, then, Indigenous Australians don't sort of have, hope to begin with, but also examples that they can follow, examples that can help in finding their own ways forward. So, those success stories are so important. And of course, just recently there was the wonderful article about those young girls and boys in the Kimberley who have graduated year 12. It's always, for me, I'm incredibly over the moon when I can see kids from communities who are, who have made it through despite all the challenges that they have to face to complete their education in year 12. And even if, again, just a small number of those go on to further education elsewhere, then they are the little wins, they are the little successes that are experienced along the way. And it is so important to share those stories far and wide.
Can I just add something on the back of that as well? Self-esteem is so important, and belief in yourself and belief in your family and seeing the opportunities in life. One of the really sad things that I see lately is in regard to this critical type race theory, which talks about you being a victim and oppressed. So what sort of message are we sending to our kids? We should be sending a clear message to them. Your colour doesn't make you a victim. It doesn't make you oppressed. We live in a world now where the world's your oyster, and you can go and learn to fly off the aeroplane when they actually get off the ground again, and you can learn. You can be a doctor and a very good doctor. And we see the results that when some of these opportunities happen. You see incredible people out there who have done amazing things, and I just admire what they've achieved and what they've done. And so, and a lot of that gets back to, and this is a whole area of research, that why people are successful is because of that self-esteem, that belief in themselves and that belief in those opportunities. And if you keep on beating kids over the head, then you're really struggling.
A final question for everybody just before we wrap up today. If there's one thing that you can change, we've got to keep it to one. If there's one thing you'd change that could see more Indigenous Australians overcome the odds in education and economic life, what would that be? Can I go to Lorraine first?
Children all need to learn how to read. I'm the president of Learning Difficulties Australia, and we've got We've got literacy rates, where 75% of kids, in school are having difficulty, and that's just terrible. 3 to 5% of the population have enduring difficulties learning how to read. The great majority can learn how to read if we get the right methods, and that includes anybody in Australia.
And Warren, one thing, how do we overcome the odds?
Overcoming the odds is getting kids to school. That is the first thing that we have to do, is get kids to school. And as I said, even if it's a bad school, at least it's better than not coming to school, because you get no education at all. And it's not only in Australia, but on a global stage, we know that in Japan, China, South Korea, Africa, and every other place in the world, you've got to get kids to school. And in Lorraine, once you get them to school, they will learn to read and write, and they will learn to do maths, and they will learn everything that's chucked at them.
And Jacinta, with the last word, how do we overcome the odds?
Remove ideology from all our educational institutions and replace it with common sense and the fundamentals for any human being to progress forward and get a decent education. And just quickly, I think we should also duplicate Lorraine and put her in every university in Australia.
Just clone her.
Clone her.
Well, there's a sharp policy recommendation for anyone listening to this one, is find a way to clone Lorraine and reproduce the work of the project all over the country. But sadly, that's all we have time for today. To be continued, I'm sure. From everybody here at the CIS, a big thank you to Lorraine, Warren and Jacinta for what was a great discussion. I hope you enjoyed it too. Thanks very much.
Okay then, good on you.
Now, for decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice, working tirelessly to deliver evidence-based public policy, especially in the areas of education and Indigenous affairs. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. CIS relies solely on the generosity of people like you to help us advance our cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved. I look forward to seeing you next time here at the CIS. Bye for now.